Every parent and every caregiver knows the universal challenge, the fussy crying baby who refuses to sleep. It is a test of patience, a call for gentleness, for soft lullabies and quiet rocking. It is a moment that demands selfless care. But what if a caregiver decides to take a shortcut? What if, out of a desire for personal convenience, they reach not for a comforting embrace, but for a bottle of adult medicine? What if they decide to turn a common over-the-counter drug into a lethal substance, all for the prize of a few quiet hours to themselves? In a quiet suburb of Reynoldsburg, Ohio, the Moly family trusted Lorie Conley. She wasn't a stranger from an agency. She was a longtime friend, a familiar face in their social circle who had babysat their 8-month-old son, Hadex, on multiple occasions. They believed she was a responsible and caring person, someone who would treat their son as her own. This was a casual, everyday arrangement, built on the simple foundation of friendship. That foundation of trust would prove to be tragically misplaced. The day of the incident began like any other. In May of 2016, Hadex's mother dropped him off at Lorie Conley's house for the day, expecting to pick him up that evening. A few hours later, however, she received the phone call that every parent fears. It was Conley, reportedly hysterical, claiming she had put Hadex down for a nap, and when she went to check on him, he was unresponsive and not breathing. The baby was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Little Hadex Moly was pronounced dead. In the immediate aftermath, Conley played the part of a devastated friend. She offered a shoulder for the grieving parents to cry on, all while claiming she had no idea what had happened. The initial assumption was a tragic, unexplained case of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. For weeks, the family mourned what they believed was a terrible natural tragedy, with the person responsible for their son's death pretending to mourn alongside them. But the autopsy soon revealed a disturbing truth that had nothing to do with natural causes. The medical examiner found a significant and lethal quantity of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in the common allergy and sleep aid medication Benadryl, in the baby's system. The amount was so high it would have been a large dose even for an adult. For an 8-month-old baby, it was a fatal dose. This was not a case of SIDS. This was a poisoning. The investigation immediately zeroed in on the only person who was with Hadex when he died, Lorie Conley. When police confronted her with the toxicology report, her story of a tragic accident fell apart. She confessed. She admitted that she had given the baby an adult dose of Benadryl. Her motive was as straightforward as it was troubling. There was no deep-seated animosity, no complex plot, no apparent psychotic break. She gave the baby a fatal overdose for one simple reason. She wanted him to go to sleep so she could have some peace and quiet. This was not presented as a mistake, but as a conscious choice. Lorie Conley, a grown woman and a mother herself, was reportedly annoyed that a baby was acting like a baby. She wanted to relax, and the infant in her care was an inconvenience. So, she chose to drug him into silence, gambling his life against her own desire for a quiet afternoon. The disregard for the infant's safety was profound. Her trial was a sober look at the deadly consequences of severe negligence. The prosecution portrayed her as a careless and profoundly irresponsible woman who was aware of the dangers of giving adult medication to an infant, but did it anyway because her own convenience was more important than a child's life. Her defense attorneys tried to argue that it was a tragic error in judgment, but the overwhelming amount of the drug in Hadex's system indicated this was far beyond a simple mistake. The jury saw it as an act of intentional harm born from a desire for convenience. In 2017, they found Lorie Conley guilty. As of 2025, Lorie Conley is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She was sentenced to life in prison, but will be eligible for parole after serving 15 years. The Moly family, who lost their son to her selfish act, now fights to ensure she serves her full sentence, forced to relive their loss every time her parole date approaches. The case of Lorie Conley is a disturbing story about the danger of indifference. She wasn't a stereotypical villain, but something far more common. A normal person whose prioritization of her own comfort led to a fatal outcome. In a culture that often seeks quick fixes for daily inconveniences, How do we reinforce the critical distinction between a simple lapse in judgment and an act of profound negligence with irreversible consequences? Patience. It is the single most important virtue a caregiver can possess. It is the quiet strength required to soothe a crying child, the gentle perseverance needed to navigate a toddler's tantrum, and the calm assurance that forms the bedrock of a safe and loving home. For a parent, trusting a babysitter is an act of faith in their patience and their self-control. But what if that faith is tragically misplaced? What if behind a babysitter's friendly and capable demeanor is a capacity for sudden, intense anger? What if a baby's cry is not a call for comfort, but a trigger for a violent outburst? In Fresno, California, Megan Martson was a trusted friend and babysitter. To the parents of one 8-month-old Jaden Rose, she was a reliable and seemingly caring young woman they felt comfortable leaving their son with. She was part of their circle, a familiar face who had proven herself capable. They had no way of knowing that Martson was hiding a significant issue with anger management, a volatile temper that was completely incompatible with the stressful realities of caring for a small child. Their trust would lead to a tragic outcome for their son. The events began on a day that started like any other. Jaden's parents dropped him off at Martson's home for the day, expecting to return that evening to their happy, healthy son. Instead, they returned to a deeply distressing scene. They found their son limp, unresponsive, and struggling to breathe. There were visible bruises on his small body and significant swelling on his head. Martson, seeing their panic, immediately began to provide a series of changing and inconsistent explanations. Her first story was that Jaden had fallen off a child-sized couch. When the severity of his injuries made that explanation seem unlikely, Martson's story began to change. She then claimed that she had accidentally dropped him in the kitchen. When that account was questioned, she added another layer, claiming another child had pushed him over. The constantly shifting narrative was the first undeniable sign that this was no accident, but an attempt to conceal what had happened. At the hospital, doctors confirmed the parents' worst fears. Jaden's injuries were extensive and severe, and in no way consistent with a simple household fall. He had multiple skull fractures, massive brain swelling, and internal bleeding. The doctors recognized they were looking at a case of severe, non-accidental trauma. Despite their best efforts, Jaden's injuries were too severe. He was declared brain dead and died a few days later. With the medical evidence proving a violent act had occurred, police brought Megan Martson in for interrogation. Faced with the undeniable proof that her stories were false, she finally confessed to what had occurred. There was no fall from a couch. No other child was to blame. She was the one responsible. She told investigators that on that day, Jaden had been fussy and wouldn't stop crying. Her patience, already limited, had run out. Consumed by intense anger, she lost control. She admitted to forcefully shaking the little boy. Then, in an act of extreme, unrestrained anger, she struck the 8-month-old's head against the hard floor not once, but multiple times. It was a confession detailing an act of extreme violence, a fatal outburst from the very person paid to ensure a child's safety. Her motive was as simple as it was disturbing. She was annoyed. A baby acting like a baby had triggered an intensity of anger that she was either unwilling or unable to control. The trial painted a serious picture of her character. The prosecution portrayed her as a woman with a dangerous, unmanaged anger problem. Someone who lacked the fundamental emotional maturity and self-control required to be around children. They presented the medical evidence as proof of the extreme force she had used. Her own lies were used as proof that she was fully aware of her guilt. In 2015, Megan Martson was found guilty of second-degree murder and felony child abuse. As of 2025, she is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison and will not be eligible for parole until she has served the full 25 years. This was not a case of complex psychosis or a premeditated plot. This was a story about the common and dangerous potential of human anger. It's a stark reminder that behind a calm exterior can lie a potential for violence, waiting for the smallest trigger to be unleashed. In our efforts to protect children from obvious external threats, how do we account for the less visible but equally potent danger of a trusted individual's inability to manage their own internal anger? Parents do their best to protect their children. They check references, they ask questions, and they look for any red flag that might suggest a person is unfit to be a caregiver. But what if a person's most concerning history is buried so deep it is nearly impossible to find? What if the seemingly responsible young woman you hire is concealing a past so troubling that it includes a conviction for a murder-for-hire plot? This is the unsettling story of a perpetrator who was hiding in plain sight. Her history revealed only after it was far too late. In the Boston suburb of Waltham, Massachusetts, the parents of 5-month-old Michael Needham thought they had found the perfect babysitter. Melissa Haskell was a two-year-old local woman who came across as sweet, reliable, and wonderful with their infant son. They had done their due diligence, and she seemed like a perfectly safe choice. They had no idea they had just entrusted their child to a woman with a documented history of soliciting a violent act. The family's world was tragically altered on a winter day in February of 1991. Melissa Haskell made an urgent 911 call, claiming that she had put baby Michael down for a nap, and when she checked on him, he was unresponsive and not breathing. She told paramedics he must have choked on his formula. The baby was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. For a short time, Haskell played the part of the distraught, traumatized babysitter caught in a tragic accident, but the autopsy soon exposed her story as a fabrication. The medical examiner found no formula in the baby's lungs. Instead, the evidence pointed to a deliberate act of harm. There were signs of compression on his face and chest, and the official cause of death was asphyxiation. Baby Michael hadn't choked. He had died as a result of forceful asphyxiation. As police began investigating the seemingly sweet babysitter, they made a discovery that turned a tragic crime into a story of an unexpected and disturbing history. They ran a background check and uncovered Melissa Haskell's secret criminal past. It turned out that just a few years earlier, as a teenager, she had been convicted of a shocking crime, soliciting to commit murder. She had become obsessed with her ex-boyfriend and had tried to hire a high school classmate to harm his new girlfriend for the price of $500. The classmate went to the police, and Haskell was arrested and convicted. The authorities and the Needham family were alarmed. They realized they were not dealing with a young woman who had simply lost control in a moment of frustration. They were dealing with a manipulative individual with a documented history of plotting violence against those who she perceived as an inconvenience. The motive for harming the 5-month-old baby was believed to be disturbingly simple. The infant was reportedly crying and fussy, and Haskell, a woman whose response to problems had previously involved plotting violence, became frustrated. Her response, colored by her established pattern of behavior, was to silence him permanently. She then invented the choking story to cover her tracks. Her trial was a detailed look into a deeply troubled history. The prosecution was legally allowed to introduce her prior conviction, painting a compelling picture for the jury of a manipulative woman who had tried to arrange a violent act before and had now committed one. Her defense, sticking to the debunked choking story, was no match for the powerful medical evidence and the shocking revelation of her past. In 1992, the jury found Melissa Haskell guilty of first-degree murder. As of 2025, Melissa Haskell is in her 52nd and is incarcerated at MCI Framingham, a medium-security women's prison in Massachusetts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and will remain incarcerated for the rest of her life. Her case is a stark warning that you can never truly know the secrets a person is hiding. She was a person with a proven history of plotting violence, who was given the keys to a home and the care of a helpless child. When the systems designed to track past criminal behavior have limitations, such as sealed juvenile records, what practical steps can a society take to prevent individuals with a history of planned violence from being placed in positions of absolute trust? Rage. It is one of the most primal and destructive of human emotions. We have seen what can happen when a caregiver's patience is exhausted, when the stress of a crying child ignites a fatal outburst. But what happens when the rage has nothing to do with the child at all? What if a babysitter, consumed by a deep and bitter anger at her own life, decides to use the innocent children in her care as nothing more than instruments in a devastating conflict against her husband? This final, disturbing story is about the power of displaced fury and how a quiet suburban home became a scene of profound violence. To the outside world, life seemed perfect in the affluent Chicago suburb of Naperville, Illinois. It was a town of sprawling homes, pristine lawns, and a sense of absolute safety. Here, 40-year-old Elzbieta Plackowska, a Polish immigrant, was living her version of the American dream. She was a stay-at-home mother to her 7-year-old son, Justin, while her husband, a long-haul trucker, provided for the family. She also regularly babysat for her neighbors, the Dworisowski family, and their 5-year-old daughter, Olivia. She was a trusted, familiar presence. No one could see the deep cracks forming beneath her ordinary suburban facade, or the combination of resentment and rage that was building, ready to erupt in an act of extreme violence. That eruption came on the night of October 30th, 2012. Plackowska was at the Dworisowski home, watching over Olivia and her own son, Justin, who was there for a playdate. The children were told to get ready for bed. A few hours later, Plackowska began making a series of bizarre and distressed phone calls. She called her church, telling a priest that intruders had broken in. She called her adult son, telling him to come home because something terrible had happened. When police were finally dispatched to the Dworisowski home to investigate, they walked into a scene of extreme violence. In a master bedroom, they discovered the bodies of Justin Plackowska and Olivia Dworisowski. A later examination revealed that both children had sustained multiple, severe sharp force injuries. The number of wounds was extensive, exceeding 100 for Justin and 50 for Olivia. The family's 2 pet dogs were also found deceased with similar injuries. Plackowska was found at the scene, covered in blood, with superficial, self-inflicted cuts on her arms. Her story of an intruder immediately fell apart, and she confessed to the act. The motive was one of the most disturbing in criminal history. This was not about a crying child or a momentary loss of control. This was a calculated act of revenge against her husband. She admitted she was deeply angry with him. She felt he was a distant and unappreciative husband who was always on the road, leaving her alone. That day, after a heated argument on the phone, her rage had reached its peak. To punish him, to make him suffer in the most severe way possible, she decided to harm the one thing he loved more than anything in the world, their son. Her confession was a chilling, step-by-step account. She took 2 kitchen knives, walked into the room, and told both children to get on their knees and pray. Then, the attack began. She harmed her own son, and then she turned to 5-year-old Olivia, harming her simply because the little girl was there to witness the first act. In a final, alternate justification, she claimed she harmed her own son because she didn't want him to grow up with a terrible mother, and she harmed Olivia so her son wouldn't be alone on his journey to heaven. Her trial was a dramatic battle over her sanity. Her defense attorneys argued she was legally insane, that a combination of severe depression, a family history of mental illness, and a recent death had triggered a psychotic break. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. They argued this was a calculated act of pure, conscious revenge, pointing to a chilling statement she had made to her husband. "You have your fun now. I will have mine." This wasn't psychosis, they argued, but the ultimate act of domestic retribution, using children to inflict emotional agony on her husband. In 2017, the jury rejected her insanity plea, finding her guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. As of 2025, Elzbieta Plackowska is incarcerated at the Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. She was sentenced to natural life in prison and will remain incarcerated for the rest of her life. Her case is a horrifying look at how domestic anger can escalate into an act of violence that defies comprehension. a stark reminder that the most dangerous acts are sometimes driven not by a loss of reality, but by the common human emotions of resentment and revenge. When the bonds of family are weaponized, and a child becomes a target not of direct anger but of displaced revenge, how do we begin to comprehend the psychological path that turns a parent into the ultimate threat?
There are 2 stars now that will always lead us forward. Thank you.
She is more than an employer. She is the guardian of your most precious treasure, the person you entrust with the safety of your children in the sanctuary of your own home. She can become a part of the family, a second mother whose hands you pay to feed, to soothe, and to protect. You give her your trust, absolutely and without question. But what happens when that trust is catastrophically misplaced? What if the quiet, seemingly reliable individual you welcomed into your family is harboring deep-seated resentment? And what if the hands paid to protect are the same ones that cause irreparable harm when no one is watching? To the outside world, Marina and Kevin Krim were living a successful New York City life. They had a beautiful family and a spacious, luxurious apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Their lives revolved around their 3 children: 6-year-old Lucia, affectionately known as Lulu, 2-year-old Leo, and 3-year-old Nessie. To help manage their busy lives, they hired a nanny, a 50-year-old woman from the Dominican Republic named Yoseline Ortega. For 2 years, Ortega was a fixture in their home. She was quiet, reliable, and the children appeared to be fond of her. The Krims treated her like a member of the family, even paying for her to fly home and joining her on a family vacation. They believed she was a loving, dedicated caregiver. They were unaware of the complex personal struggles and growing animosity that were reportedly developing beneath the surface. The afternoon of October 25th, 2012, was the day their world was irrevocably altered. Marina Krim had taken her middle child, Nessie, to a swimming lesson and had arranged to meet Ortega with Lulu and Leo there afterward, but they never arrived. Confused, Marina sent a text to Ortega. There was no reply. A sense of unease began to grow. She rushed back to their apartment building, the silence of the elevator amplifying her increasing concern. When she opened the door, the apartment was dark and eerily quiet. She called out their names, but only silence answered. As she walked through the rooms, she saw a faint light coming from under the master bathroom door. The tragedy that awaited her on the other side would become a matter of public record and profound sorrow. What she discovered was a scene of immense tragedy. The evidence inside indicated that her 2 children, Lulu and Leo, had sustained multiple severe injuries. Standing nearby was Yoseline Ortega, who then inflicted a serious, self-inflicted injury to her own neck with a kitchen knife. The sound of profound distress that came from Marina Krim alerted the entire building that a terrible event had occurred. The subsequent investigation and trial sought to uncover a motive as disturbing as the act itself. The prosecution argued this was not a sudden, random event, but the culmination of a long-held and deep-seated resentment. Ortega's personal life was reportedly in disarray. She was facing significant financial problems and had recently been forced to move with her own son from their apartment back into a relative's crowded home in the Bronx. Every day, she would leave her own troubled reality and enter the Krim's world of apparent affluence and happiness. It was argued that she grew to resent them for it. She was allegedly jealous of Marina, whom she perceived as a perfect mother with a perfect life. She had complained to her family that the Krims were working her too hard and that they demanded she perform housekeeping duties in addition to her role as a nanny. According to the prosecution's narrative, this envy festered, the resentment grew, and in her perspective, the children became symbols of a life she felt was unattainable. And so, the prosecution contended, she decided to destroy them. At her trial, Ortega's defense lawyers argued that she was not legally responsible due to insanity, claiming she was suffering from a severe psychosis and had been experiencing auditory hallucinations commanding her to commit the acts. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that this was a calculated, deliberate act of revenge committed by a woman consumed by hatred. They detailed the severity of the incident. Forensic evidence revealed that Lulu, who was old enough to comprehend the situation, had defensive wounds, indicating she had tried to protect herself. This was presented not as the work of a detached mind, but of an individual motivated by anger and a desire for retribution. The jury concurred with the prosecution. In 2018, after a harrowing 6-week trial, Yoseline Ortega was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to the maximum penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, the judge described her actions as pure evil, ensuring she would spend the remainder of her life incarcerated. As of 2025, Yoseline Ortega is incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. In an act of incredible strength and resilience, the Krim family founded the Lulu and Leo Fund, a charity that promotes creativity in children. Through this initiative, they ensure their children's names are remembered for the light they brought into the world, not the darkness that ended their lives. Yet, the case of Yoseline Ortega remains a permanent, chilling example of the potential for a trusted individual to conceal dangerous intentions, the ultimate parental nightmare brought to life. In a world where we must place trust in others to care for our loved ones, how can we navigate the unsettling reality that we may never truly know the private struggles and resentments of those we let into our homes?
Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Guilty of what?
Guilty of murder in the 2nd degree.
Why did they do that to me? Why did they do that to me?
The au pair. The very concept is built on a foundation of youthful optimism and cultural exchange. A young person arrives from a foreign land, not just as an employee, but as a temporary family member, an older sibling figure to your children. You welcome them into your home, believing their inexperience is balanced by their kindness. But what happens when that perceived innocence becomes the centerpiece of an international legal case? What if the trusted caregiver is accused of an act so severe it sparks a firestorm of public debate? And what if, in the end, no one can agree on whether the individual is a perpetrator or the subject of a profound injustice? In 1996, Sunil and Deborah Eappen, 2 respected doctors living in a peaceful Boston suburb, hired one 9-year-old Louise Woodward. She was a young woman from a small town in England seeking a year of experience in America. To the Eappens, she seemed like a suitable person to care for their 2 young sons, Brendan and 8-month-old Matthew. It was a standard arrangement, a portrait of modern family life, repeated in thousands of homes. But within months, this seemingly ordinary situation would be shattered, and the Eappens' home would become the epicenter of one of the most controversial legal battles of the late 20th century. The sequence of events began with an urgent 911 call on February 4, 1997. The caller was Louise Woodward. She told the dispatcher that the baby in her care, Matthew Eappen, was having difficulty breathing and had become unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find a critical situation. Matthew was unconscious, his breathing shallow. He was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital, where doctors discovered a range of extensive injuries. He had a significant skull fracture, bleeding on the brain, and severe retinal hemorrhaging. To the medical experts, these findings were consistent with the diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome. Their assessment was direct. The child had been subjected to forceful shaking and an impact with a hard surface. The only person with him when the injuries were thought to have occurred was his au pair. Following this medical assessment, perceptions of the young Englishwoman shifted dramatically. Louise Woodward was arrested and charged in connection with the death of Matthew Eappen. The statements she gave to police were reportedly inconsistent. First, she claimed she had no idea what had happened. Then, under questioning, she admitted that she might have been a little rough with Matthew. She told investigators she had popped him on the bed and that he may have hit his head. To prosecutors, This was an admission of responsibility. They built their case around a direct narrative that Louise, a young and immature individual, had grown frustrated with the infant and resentful of the family's rules, including a strict curfew. In a moment of intense frustration, they argued, she inflicted the injuries that led to his comatose state. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was a transatlantic media event. How does such intense international media coverage impact a justice system's ability to operate? The American media often portrayed her as a cold and culpable individual, but in the United Kingdom, her situation became a national cause. The British press frequently painted her as a naive local girl facing an aggressive and unfamiliar American justice system. Her family and friends started a campaign to support her, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for her defense. The courtroom became a battleground, not just over her guilt, but over the very science of shaken baby syndrome, with world-renowned experts on both sides presenting completely contradictory testimony. The prosecution's medical experts claimed Matthew's injuries were recent and could only have been inflicted with immense force. In response, the defense's experts argued the critical injury was weeks old, a pre-existing condition that had tragically re-bled on that day. After weeks of extensive testimony, the jury delivered a verdict that garnered significant international attention. They found Louise Woodward guilty of second-degree murder, a conviction that carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The image of the 9-year-old collapsing in tears was broadcast to a global audience. In England, there was widespread dismay. In America, many felt the verdict was appropriate, but the story took one final, unprecedented turn. The trial judge, Hilla Zobel, made a highly unusual decision. 10 days after the verdict, in a notable legal maneuver, he set aside the jury's murder conviction. He cited the intense public atmosphere surrounding the trial and declared that the circumstances were characterized by confusion, inexperience, frustration, immaturity, and some anger, but not malice. He reduced the charge to involuntary manslaughter and sentenced her to the 279 days she had already served in jail. Louise Woodward, having been convicted of causing a child's death, was set free. As of 2025, Louise Woodward is in her late 42nd and lives a quiet life back in England. After her release, she graduated from law school and is now a mother herself, reportedly teaching dance classes in a small town. To this day, she maintains her absolute innocence. The Eappen family has always maintained their belief that she was responsible for their son's death. The case of the British au pair remains a contentious issue in legal and medical history, leaving behind a legacy of doubt and a fundamental question that has never been fully resolved. When a case is defined by conflicting expert testimony and intense public pressure, can a legal verdict ever truly provide a definitive answer, or does it simply create a different version of uncertainty? For millions of parents, the home daycare is the perfect solution. A safe, nurturing environment that feels like a home away from home, run by a loving, experienced, almost grandmotherly figure. You drop your child off every morning believing they're in the safest possible hands. But what if that loving home is a place of profound risk? What if the trusted caregiver is a perpetrator of harm, and the string of mysterious infant deaths that seem to surround her are not tragic coincidences, but a disturbing pattern of abuse? In the small town of Newark, New York, Diane Odell was a pillar of the childcare community. For years, she ran a popular and seemingly reputable daycare out of her own home. To the dozens of parents who entrusted her with their children, she was an invaluable support, an experienced, caring provider who had a special way with infants. Her reputation was spotless. Her home was a place of trust. But beneath the surface of this idyllic arrangement, a concerning pattern was emerging. One by one, babies in Diane Odell's care were experiencing life-threatening emergencies. The unraveling of her undisclosed actions began with the death of 3-month-old Andrew Lavender in 1985. Odell claimed she put the baby down for a nap and returned to find him lifeless in his crib. It was a deeply distressing event for the family, and at first, the official cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. It was viewed as a devastating tragedy. However, one investigator, aware of the rumors and concerns that surrounded Odell's daycare, refused to accept that so many rare incidents could occur by chance in the same place. He began to look into Odell's history, and what he found was a significant pattern of deaths and near-deaths that all pointed back to one individual. He discovered that another infant, a 4-month-old named Peter, had also died of supposed SIDS while in Odell's care just a few years earlier. The investigator then uncovered a series of other incidents involving children who had suffered from sudden, unexplained episodes of apnea, a critical condition where a child simply stops breathing. Miraculously, those children had survived, but the pattern was undeniable. This was not a daycare experiencing a series of tragic coincidences. It was a site of repeated harm. The difficult truth, investigators concluded, was that Diane Odell was a serial perpetrator. Her method involved inducing asphyxiation by obstructing an infant's breathing. It was a quiet method that left little to no physical evidence and produced symptoms that perfectly mimicked the tragic mystery of SIDS, allowing her to conceal her actions in plain sight for years. The motive behind her actions was believed to be a form consistent with factitious disorder imposed on another, a psychological condition where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in those under their care to gain attention and sympathy. It is believed she would cause the infants to stop breathing until they were on the brink of death and then discover them, initiating a frantic effort to revive them and casting herself in the role of the heroic, life-saving caregiver. But sometimes this dangerous pattern of behavior went too far, and the children she was harming for attention would die. Her trial was a landmark case that hinged on the statistical impossibility of her claims. The prosecution argued that the odds of multiple SIDS deaths and apnea events occurring under the care of a single, unrelated individual were astronomical. They brought in the parents of the other children who had mysteriously stopped breathing at her daycare, painting a compelling picture of a serial abuser. In 1987, after a long and complex trial, the jury saw the pattern for what it was. They found Diane Odell guilty of murder. As of 2025, Diane Odell is in her 72nd and remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison and has been denied parole multiple times, with the board citing her refusal to take responsibility for her actions and the calculated nature of her harmful behavior. Her case is a troubling reminder that even a long and spotless reputation can be a facade, and that significant dangers can often be found where they are least expected. When a crime is designed to mimic a known medical tragedy, how can a community and the justice system protect the vulnerable from a perpetrator hidden behind a mask of compassion? There is a concerning archetype of perpetrator known as the angel of death caregivers who, instead of healing, inflict harm. Often, their actions are concealed behind the veil of natural causes or unexplained medical events. We may associate this pattern with clinical settings, but what if it emerges not with a nurse, but with a simple babysitter from the community? What if a person is followed not by bad luck, but by a pattern of death so consistent that it challenges belief until it's too late? This is the story of an individual whose crimes went undetected, in part because of the world's perception of her. In the small rural towns of Central Florida, Christine Falling was a familiar, if somewhat troubled, figure. She had lived a difficult life, with a documented history of epilepsy, developmental disabilities, and a host of compulsive behaviors. She often came across as unassuming, and to the families and friends in her tight-knit community who hired her to babysit, she seemed utterly harmless. They saw her not as a threat, but as someone to be assisted by offering her a small job. No one could have imagined that this young woman was responsible for one of the most persistent series of crimes against children in American history. The disturbing pattern of deaths began on a winter day in 1,980 inches, the town of Blountstown. On her very first day babysitting 2-year-old Cassidy Johnson, the child died. Falling gave a distraught and unclear account of how the little girl had simply stopped breathing. In the absence of obvious signs of foul play, and perhaps influenced by a reluctance to suspect the seemingly non-threatening babysitter, doctors ruled the death an accident caused by blunt trauma to the head, consistent with a fall. Just 3 months later, in nearby Lakeland, 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis died while in Falling's care. Once again, she presented herself as a distraught and unlucky caregiver, and once again, doctors found a plausible medical explanation, attributing his death to myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart. 2 deaths of children in 3 months, both in the care of the same individual, should have been a significant cause for concern. This, however, was only the beginning. In 1981, the pattern continued within her own family. Her 2-year-old cousin, Joseph Spring, died after she had reportedly taken him to the doctor for a viral infection. A few months after that, 8-month-old William Swindle died in his crib while Falling was babysitting. With each death, her portrayal of grief reportedly became more practiced, and her story of being unlucky became more polished. The community, however, was growing suspicious. A dark nickname began to follow her: the killer babysitter. The truth was that Christine Falling was a methodical perpetrator. Her preferred method was chillingly simple and, for a long time, tragically effective. She would wait until she was alone with a child and then cause asphyxiation, often by pressing the child's face into a soft object like a blanket or pillow until they stopped breathing. She later referred to this technique as blanket magic. It left no stab wounds, no bruises, no obvious evidence of a crime. She was, in effect, exploiting the tragic mystery of sudden infant death syndrome to conceal her actions time and time again. Her final act was the one that led to a breakthrough in the case. In July of 1982, 10-week-old Travis Coleman died while in her care. This time, the autopsy was performed by a medical examiner who was aware of the dark rumors that followed Christine Falling. He conducted a more thorough examination and found clear, undeniable evidence of suffocation, tiny, telltale hemorrhages that could only have been caused by deliberate asphyxiation. The police finally had definitive proof of a homicide. They brought Christine Falling in for questioning. Under the pressure of interrogation and confronted with the conclusive medical evidence, she finally confessed. She admitted to causing the deaths of not only Travis Coleman but also Joseph Spring and Cassidy Johnson. Her stated motive was as unusual as it was disturbing. She told investigators that she had an uncontrollable urge to harm them whenever they cried or became fussy, stating she heard a strange sound and wanted to make it stop. But she also revealed a second, more self-serving motive. She craved the attention and sympathy she received whenever a child died in her care. It was a disturbing pattern consistent with factitious disorder, but instead of just making the children sick for attention, she was causing their deaths to receive it. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, Christine Falling pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, though she is suspected in at least 2 more deaths. She was sentenced to life in prison. As of 2025, she remains incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She has been eligible for parole since 2006, but has been denied at every hearing, with the board citing the repetitive nature of her crimes and the powerful testimony of her victims' families, who advocate to ensure she remains incarcerated for life. Her case is a troubling look at how a perpetrator can operate in plain sight, using a non-threatening facade and the world's pity as a form of camouflage. How do our societal preconceptions about vulnerability and harmlessness affect our ability to recognize a potential threat, especially when it comes from a person who themselves appears to need protection? In moments of crisis, society often looks for heroes, individuals of immense courage who move toward danger as others flee. The hero is a symbol of our best selves, but what if that heroism is a constructed performance? What if the desire for applause and admiration becomes a psychological compulsion, a need so profound that it can only be satisfied by manufacturing a tragedy. What if the caregiver you celebrate for surviving a deadly fire is, in fact, the individual responsible for starting it? All for a fleeting moment of public attention. In the affluent New York suburb of Pound Ridge, William and Denise Fischer were starting their new life as parents. They had successful careers, a beautiful home, and their world was made complete with the birth of their daughter, Christy. To help them, they hired a 20-year-old au pair from Switzerland named Olivia Riner. She appeared to be an ideal candidate. Her references were impeccable. Her demeanor was professional, and she had a calm, confident presence that instantly put the new parents at ease. She was everything they could have wanted in a caregiver, and they quickly came to trust her with the most precious person in their lives. They were unaware that they had just welcomed an individual with a history of arson into their home. The family's idyllic world was shattered on the night of December 2nd, 1991. The Fischers were out for the evening, having left their 6-week-old daughter in the sole, trusted care of Olivia Riner. Later that night, an urgent 911 call reported a house fire at their address. When neighbors rushed outside, they saw an alarming scene as flames emerged from the Fischers' home. Then, out of the smoke came Olivia Riner. She appeared hysterical, her face stained with soot and her voice filled with panic. Her story was deeply concerning. She claimed a fire had erupted without warning, and she had tried desperately to fight through the thick black smoke to get to baby Christy's room, but the blaze was too intense, forcing her to flee for her own safety. In the immediate aftermath, Riner was treated as a heroic figure, a tragic victim who had done everything she could. The community offered support to the young woman who had barely escaped the fire. But when firefighters finally managed to extinguish the blaze, the narrative of a tragic accident began to be questioned. They found the body of baby Christy in her crib. The subsequent autopsy, however, revealed a critical and scientifically backed truth. The medical examiner found almost no soot or carbon monoxide in Christy's lungs. His conclusion was clear and absolute. The baby had died from asphyxiation up to 30 minutes before the fire was even set. The fire was not the tragedy. It was a staged event designed to conceal the actual cause of death. The individual once seen as a hero was now the prime suspect in a homicide investigation. As detectives delved into Olivia Riner's past, their investigation led them to her home country of Switzerland. What they found there was a clear and troubling pattern. This was not the first mysterious fire to occur on Olivia Riner's watch. In fact, authorities linked her to at least 4 other suspicious blazes at homes where she had previously worked as a nanny. The investigation suggested Olivia Riner was a serial arsonist whose actions had escalated. The trial exposed the depths of a complex psychological condition. Prosecutors argued that Riner was driven by a dangerous hero complex, a form of factitious disorder where an individual fabricates a crisis so they can be hailed as a savior for resolving or surviving it. Her life, they contended, was a performance in which she was the central figure. She craved attention, admiration, and the drama of being at the center of a tragedy. For years, she had allegedly satisfied this psychological need by setting fires and then discovering them. But this time, prosecutors argued, that wasn't enough. To make her performance more believable, to make the tragedy more profound and the spotlight on her even brighter, she had deliberately caused the infant's asphyxiation before starting the fire. Throughout the trial, Riner's demeanor was noted as being unnervingly calm. She sat in court with a detached expression, showing little outward emotion. She displayed no visible grief, remorse, or fear. In 1993, after deliberating for just a few hours, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder and second-degree arson. The judge, sentencing her to the maximum of 25 years to life in prison, condemned her actions, calling the death of a defenseless baby the ultimate crime of a depraved mind. As of 2025, Olivia Riner is in her 52nd and remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. She has been denied parole on multiple occasions, with the board noting her pronounced lack of remorse and the calculated nature of her actions. Her case is a deeply disturbing look at a psychological condition where the desperate need for attention can lead to dangerous and harmful acts. When a person's psychological need for attention is so profound that they are willing to create a tragedy, how can we discern a genuine hero from someone performing a role they wrote for themselves? A nanny is supposed to be a source of calm and stability, a gentle presence who helps to build a safe and nurturing world for children. You trust them not just with your child's physical safety, but with their developing mind, believing they will fill it with kindness and care. But what happens when a caregiver's own mind is grappling with forces that are not visible to the outside world? What if their actions are guided not by their employer, but by a distorted perception of reality that compels them toward harmful acts? And what if they choose to turn a bustling city street into the stage for a public event so disturbing it captures widespread attention? In Moscow, Russia, the Mesheryakov family believed they had found a dedicated caregiver for their 4-year-old daughter, Nastya, who had cerebral palsy and epilepsy and required constant, specialized care. They hired Gyulchekhra Bobokulova, a 8-year-old immigrant from Uzbekistan, to be her full-time nanny. For 3 years, Bobokulova was a professional and seemingly loving caregiver. The family trusted her completely, believing she was a compassionate woman who had a special bond with their vulnerable child. They were unaware she was hiding a long and severe history of schizophrenia, or that her personal views were reportedly being influenced by extremist ideology. The family's world was irrevocably changed on the morning of February 29, 2016. Nastya's parents left for work with their older son, leaving their daughter in the care of the woman they had trusted for years. Hours later, their ordinary day was shattered by an urgent phone call. Their apartment building was on fire. When emergency crews arrived, they found the apartment damaged by flames. But the fire was not the most tragic discovery. Inside, they found the remains of the small child. The incident then moved into the public square. As smoke billowed from the apartment, police began receiving urgent calls about a woman acting erratically outside the Oktyabrskoye Pol metro station. The reports were initially difficult to comprehend due to their unusual nature. The woman, dressed in a black hijab, was shouting and holding an object in her hand. As police and onlookers got closer, the situation became tragically clear. In a deeply unsettling public display, Gyulchekhra Bobokulova was holding the severed head of 4-year-old Nastya. For the next hour, in an event captured on dozens of cell phone videos, she paced in front of the station. She shouted, "Allahu Akbar," and declared herself a terrorist. "I hate democracy," she yelled to the crowd. "I am your death." She threatened to detonate an explosive device, creating a tense standoff where the primary evidence of the act she had already committed was on public display. The image of the woman in black became a widely circulated and disturbing symbol of the event. The investigation into her motive revealed a complex and troubling combination of untreated mental illness and religious extremism. Bobokulova claimed she had harmed the little girl as an act of retaliation for Russia's airstrikes in Syria. She told investigators that Allah ordered her to do it. The reality, however, was more layered. Authorities discovered that she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier in Uzbekistan, a fact she had hidden from the family. Her already fragile mental state had reportedly been influenced by an extremist boyfriend who had filled her head with radical ideology. She was not a trained operative, but a profoundly unwell woman whose delusions had been shaped by external influences, leading her to believe that her actions were justified. Her trial focused entirely on her mental state. Was she a politically motivated individual who should be held criminally responsible, or a woman so detached from reality that she could not be? The courts ultimately decided on the latter. After extensive psychiatric evaluation, she was found to be legally insane, a paranoid schizophrenic who was not in control of her own mind when she committed the act. Instead of being sent to prison, Gyulchekhra Bobokulova was committed to a high-security psychiatric hospital for indefinite compulsory treatment. As of 2025, she remains confined within a secure psychiatric facility in Russia. While doctors report that her condition has been stabilized with medication, the prospect of her ever being released is considered highly unlikely. When an act of extreme violence is rooted in both severe mental illness and extremist ideology, how can a justice system distinguish between a patient in need of treatment and a perpetrator who must be held criminally accountable? From acts born of sudden, uncontrolled anger to methodical, premeditated plans, the stories of these individuals represent one of the most profound betrayals imaginable. They are the guardians who became perpetrators, the protectors who inflicted harm. Their actions do more than disturb. They challenge the fundamental trust that is essential to the relationship between a parent and a caregiver. These cases serve as a stark reminder that a significant threat to a child's safety can emerge not from a stranger lurking in the shadows, but from a trusted individual welcomed into the sanctity of a home. Each case, in its own way, underscores the vulnerability that is inherent in the act of entrusting a child to another person's care. As a society, how do we balance the necessary act of placing trust in caregivers with the unsettling knowledge that no amount of due diligence can ever fully reveal the private struggles, hidden histories, or sudden impulses that reside within another person's mind?